panel is really about the Public Information Act. Yannette and her panel touched on some of the problems with the PIA and also alluded to some of the changes and solutions that we tried to put in place. To set the stage, and I'll have our panelists introduce themselves in just a moment, but to set the stage, I said earlier that Marylanders for Open Government helped in the major reform of 2015. That was the first major reform of the Public Information Act. The second major reform passed in 2021, and those changes went into effect in 2022, in July of 2022. And so essentially that first major reform created this compliance board, the PIA compliance board, that would hear disputes around fees of greater than $350, but it didn't have a lot of teeth. And that's something that I think we all recognize, that we need enforceability, because without someone watching, without enforcement, nothing really changes. And so now these changes, and I'll turn to our panel after they introduce themselves to tell you more about those changes, but there are some significant things to create more power of enforcement over with the compliance board and the ombudsman's power. So with that tantalizing start, I'm going to turn to our panel, because Lisa Kershner is by Zoom. I'll start with her. Lisa, would you give us a brief introduction of who you are? Oh, and Patrick, can you make sure she's actually...
Thank you, Rebecca.
Great.
I think I'm unmuted now. I'm the Public Access Ombudsman, which is the position I've held since my program opened its doors in 2016. Rebecca and other panel members here, the stakeholders, were very instrumental in the legislation that created my office. Our central mission is to try to help agencies and requesters resolve disputes that come up about access to public records. And we do that through a process that's entirely voluntary and confidential. So it is very useful and constructive in some situations, but it is not successful in all cases. And so the changes that Rebecca was mentioning grew out of a report my office did in 2019 with an entity called the PIA Compliance Board. That is that report that led to the passage of the Equitable Access to Records Act, which we're going to be discussing more today. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Lisa. And then to my right, let's go Deb Gardner from the Public Justice Center. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Deb Gardner. I'm the legal director of the Public Justice Center and a participant in Marylanders for Open Government, which spearheaded the two legislative reforms that Rebecca has mentioned.
Great, thank you. And Deb maybe not directly files a lot of PIA requests, but certainly knows her way around the requester world. So, and then we have now Comptroller, very exciting, Brooke Lierman, who was the main sponsor and did so much work to get the 2021 reforms passed. So, Comptroller?
Great to be here. I'm Brooke Lierman. I am the state comptroller for all of 5 days, 4 sort of, and I'm really excited about being here and about the work that continues to be done. And you know, I'm excited to share my perspective now that I'm in an agency to see, obviously it's only been a few days, but some of the things that I've learned about what some of the barriers are, and that I think we need to make sure that we're working with agencies to overcome so we can actually fully implement the bills that we're passing, which are so important.
Absolutely, and I think we've heard sort of as a theme throughout the panels today that legislators can't just pass a bill and then walk away and say, right, mission accomplished, job done. It's all about the implementation. And so I feel very grateful that we have advocates and supporters here to help us look at that enforcement. So before we, kind of get into some of the nuts and bolts, I wanted just to take a step back, preach to the choir, and talk for a second about why public records are important to begin with. And so, Deb, I'd love to start with you, because for your constituents or the people you work with, public records are critical in very material ways. Can you talk a little bit about the importance?
Gosh, it's hard to overstate. And the range of things about which people will make a Public Information Act request is staggering. From, for example, a person serving a sentence and wanting access to the records concerning their criminal prosecution because they want to make a post-conviction challenge and they no longer have a lawyer. That's one person. Another person in the prison in Maryland may have serious concerns about how the prison is being operated, why they're being charged so much money from their commissary for making copies in the library, why they can't get access to critical health care, and they might make a Public Information Act request concerning the healthcare contract or other issues like that. So that's one thing. So you're talking about individuals who are indigent and who have very limited access to society generally from within a prison, to public interest organizations that ask for data that agencies have in order to be able to evaluate whether the agency is treating citizens properly, for example, in terms of how timely they process their unemployment benefits applications or their applications for the SNAP program, which we all sort of know as food stamps, to organizations that are fighting companies on environmental issues and need records from the Department of the Environment, the Department of Natural Resources in order to do that. And then there's a category of people who, companies who make Public Information Act requests in order to pursue their own profits, in order to pursue their own business activities. There's that certainly is also something that's covered by the Public Information Act as well. Mm-hmm. So it's a very broad range of interests, very broad range of needs for government accountability and transparency.
And I would also add to that the public records or any record, not just a document, but it could be text, voicemails, a whole plethora of things that government creates in the course of doing its business. Those are all public records. I wanted to pop over to Lisa and see, maybe she has dropped off for a second, so we'll go to Brooke. Do you have anything to add on what you've heard in terms of or why do you feel like the Public Information Act is important and what is requested?
No, I think I agree with everything Deb said, obviously, and I think from my perspective, I started getting very interested in this after the Freddie Gray uprising, when MTA wasn't turning over the records from Mondawmin Mall and sort of the video records, and started paying more attention to some of the challenges with getting records. There were a couple Baltimore Sun articles about the high cost of getting records, and the challenges. And for me, I just felt like it makes sense. This is work that this is public work, and people should have access to it. And so just started really paying attention more to what agencies were not doing in terms of complying with the PIA. So started thinking more about how we could quantify the challenges, which led, of course, to the budget language.
Absolutely, and that in fact is so critical. And I think so. Any publicly funded entity should have access to or we should have access to those public records. And there are some defined exemptions. We've talked a little bit about investigatory exemptions, deliberative process. If I were to sort of make my wishes known, like we wouldn't have as many broad exemptions in the PIA, but we work with what we have and work to change what we have. Now that Lisa's back with us, did you have anything to add on what the importance of notice and what people are asking for?
I think Deb and Brooke have really, hit the nail on the head and covered the ground. In my office, I can kind of echo that we see a very broad range of requesters who come with all kinds of needs and concerns and issues. We have always had a very regular kind of group of people who are concerned about their interactions with law enforcement. Many are already incarcerated. Many do not have lawyers. Many have limited access to libraries and all of the obstacles and barriers that Deb was mentioning. There are many other individual citizen requesters who make requests for records because of actions or inactions of government that are impacting them. And this really, I think, gives a window into how important state and local government is in people's lives. Requests to school districts, requests to health organizations, human services organizations. It runs the whole gamut. And then there are many occupational and professional users, including media representatives. The media have always been big users of the Public Information Act, as are lawyers, businesses, nonprofit advocates, researchers. I mean, the list goes on and on. Government data and records are really important to everyone.
And I think it's interesting you say, Lisa, that it's such a broad spectrum, because you see the instances when the system does not work. And so what that says to me is that the problems in terms of public records requests and public records access are pervasive and they're system-wide. They're not just limited to law enforcement or police accountability, although we certainly don't deny that there are significant issues and problems there, but they do kind of run throughout. I like to call it the culture of opacity, that our PIA law is set up to be set so that there would be a culture of transparency, where there's a lot of vagueness in the statute because it presumes that everything is open, and it does feel nowadays like that's shifting a little bit. So I want to talk about specifically what has changed in the 2021 reforms. And Brooke, since you were the sponsor,
sure.
why don't you take it?
Sure, and actually I think that's a good place to start, is that one of the challenges that we found, and I think in another example of records that were being not properly disclosed were actually environmental reports. So over the past 8 years, we've seen a decrease in the number of clean water actions being taken, to the point where we've had the fewest number of clean water enforcement actions taken since the Clean Water Act was created and in Maryland. And so that led me to start thinking, and us to start thinking about, well, what is happening in our agencies? Who's asking for these who's making these PIA requests, and which ones are actually being followed through on and being answered? So working with Lisa, our amazing ombudsman, we put language in the Joint Chairman's report of the budget requiring Lisa to do a report detailing and working with the agencies to find data and information on the number of PIA requests that were coming in, what some of the topics were, about how many were being answered, in which amount of time, when the ombudsman was being involved, and so on. And that gave us really powerful data to demonstrate that there was not equitable access to records. And one of the key issues was that the ombudsman was really in the impossible position of having almost no enforcement authority if agencies refused to cooperate with citizens, because the mediation process was strictly voluntary. So when disputes went unresolved, the only place to go from there was court. And perhaps if you're the Baltimore Sun or you're the Washington Post, you have the resources and a lawyer on hand to be able to go to court to try to enforce a PIA. But if you're, just an average citizen or Marylander, going to circuit court, that's intimidating. It can cost money. It can be difficult. It's time consuming. And it's just not a feasible option for many. In addition, there are so many reports that we're creating these days, and lots of them are just really hard to find. And they were not reports that agencies were necessarily trying to hide. They just weren't putting them out there. And so we started trying to get back to what Rebecca said, that about disclosure. And so the bill had a number of parts, one of which first and foremost, it said that the stance of our agencies, of our public bodies, is one of proactive disclosure, which means that we should always be trying to proactively disclose reports that we're creating so that people can easily find them without having to do a PIA, right? I mean, the ideal situation is when you don't have to do a PIA because the report has been created, it's already there. Of course, we're not going to put everybody's emails, out on a website. For those types of things, you do need to do a PIA. But for those, we said, okay, we need to make sure that we're providing a better process for resolution and enforcement of the existing provisions of law, so that we created, we expanded the jurisdiction of the Public Information Act Board and created additional enforcement authority for Lisa in the Ombudsman role, so that her position actually has some teeth, that there are some time limits to things from agencies, and that people have the option of going to the board rather than to the circuit court initially to provide some actual enforcement and accountability. So I think that was really, I think, the crux of the bill, was that we were giving people an option, but we were giving the ombudsman more power, and that we're giving the board more power, so that people did not have to resort to going to circuit court. And I'm sure Lisa can tell us how it's going.
Yes. So, Lisa, did you want to just run down some of the specifics, just super briefly, because I would urge everyone to pick up the What Has Changed handout on the back table.
Yeah.
But some of the problems that I think the Real News Network reporters were talking about, theoretically were addressed in some of the changes that's gone about. So can you quick run down that list?
Sure. In terms of my work, our changes are mainly administrative in the way we manage caseloads and define issues. We're still in the process of articulating some of these changes, but some of the key points are, as Brooke was mentioning, I now have 90 days as a general rule to bring mediation matters to closure. Additionally, in order to close a file now, I have to issue something called a final determination, which is a statement of what the issue or issues were that were presented for mediation and what their outcomes were. If an issue is board eligible, and for example, if access to records were denied, and it's unresolved, so the requester will have a right to file a complaint with the board. The final determination is to be attached to that complaint, which demonstrates that mediation was attempted, but unsuccessful. That is a new requirement under the Act. Previously, the board could hear only complaints about fee disputes that were greater than $350. If your dispute did not involve a fee greater than $350, the board would not be of any use to you. But now the board is empowered to hear disputes about denials of access to records. They continue to have jurisdiction over fee disputes greater than $350. They can hear disputes about failures to respond. They can hear disputes about constructive denials, and they can also hear complaints from boards about, from agencies about requests that may be deemed vexatious or made in bad faith or something of that nature. So there's a greater user-friendly remedy available for disputes that can't get resolved in mediation that didn't exist before. And the goal of this is to make it usable by anyone. You don't need a lawyer, you need money. You just need to attempt mediation first in good faith. And if that doesn't work, you can ask for the board to review it.
Yeah. So thank you, Lisa. I think that's helpful to kind of understand kind of some of those specifics. But I want to turn to Deb, because you're living this a little bit. What does it feel like now? And I know for a lot of the people that you work with, the fee waiver issue is still probably the paramount issue. But do you feel like there's things that have been changed substantially in the practice of how you're requesting things or the outcomes?
I think mostly it's too soon to tell whether the board's new broader jurisdiction is going to make a significant difference, because it's only been in effect technically since July of last year, and I can't remember exactly when the board's regulations implementing that new jurisdiction were finalized, but it was at least at the earliest last fall, late in the year. So I don't know how many complaints are going to the board. It's not a process that my organization has chosen to use as yet, although we have had good results from invoking the Ombuds mediation authority. True, it would be helpful if the Ombud had more power, for example, subpoena. But that's not something we yet have under the law. The other thing I would say about how things are currently working is that, as you alluded to, Rebecca, a thing that did not occur in the 2021 reform bill, it was in the bill originally and did not make it into the final version, was board jurisdiction over fee waivers. We've heard some.
We tried.
We've heard earlier today about how fees are a barrier to production of documents, to access to documents, and I definitely do want to talk a bit more about that. But the fees themselves are sometimes intentionally used to prevent access to documents, and other times it may not be intentional, but the effect is the same, that the requester, whether it's a public interest organization that doesn't have a gigantic budget, or a media organization that may or may not have a lot of resources but can't afford to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars every month for records from a government agency. And sometimes it's just the result of a government agency making a very generous estimate of the fees, because they think in good faith that they don't want to sandbag a requester, with a low estimate and then charge them more for the documents later. A lot of different, whole range of ways in which fees end up as a barrier to accessing documents. And part of the problem is that there's no guidance in the statute concerning the agency's discretion about this issue currently. I mean, literally it says that the agency may waive fees if it finds that not just that the disclosure of the records is in the public interest, but that the fee waiver is in the public interest.
Okay.
And also the agency may waive fees if the person is indigent. Very, very odd to imagine why an agency should be allowed to deny the waiver if the person is in fact indigent. So there's a lot, and the statute says in determining whether to grant a public interest waiver, the agency should consider all relevant considerations, and says absolutely nothing about what those are. So whatever the agency thinks is relevant, and it gets to be considered by the agency. So then one of the things that has happened as a result of Anton's Law, which is a major step forward, is that it has sent the inquiry into whether whether to disclose records and how to disclose records into the stratosphere in terms of how custodians are responding and talking with each other and working together to come up with arguments for not disclosing records and for ways to avoid doing so, including with the fees and the fee waivers. So whatever they choose to, however they choose to justify denying the fee waiver, it may very well end up being, an outright barrier to access to the records, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the statute doesn't rein in that unfettered discretion.
It sounds from what you're saying, Deb, that it just strikes me that the fee waiver issue or the fees for records has kind of been weaponized as a tool to, the law says that the custodian has to do X, Y, and Z, but the lever that the custodian has almost unlimited ability to work with is fees. Am I getting that right?
Well, that's an interesting and colorful characterization. At the very least, it is a tremendous barrier, and it's not always intentional, but there certainly are, unfortunately, bad faith uses of the provision. And I think what's important to remember is that the statute itself, the Public Information Act, was created on a presumption of access to public information. It's right in the statute. It couldn't be more clearly stated. It couldn't be more grandiose in its connection with the importance of access to government information in a democracy. And yet, as other speakers have mentioned today, the culture in Maryland, and it's in some ways a bit unique to Maryland from what we've seen in terms of our research around the country. In Maryland, there really is a culture among government agencies, and not all of them by any means, but by too many, far too many, of exactly the reverse of the intent of the statute. The statute requires the agency to bear the burden of proof and defend a denial of access to records. Courts don't even always recognize that, frankly. It'll be interesting to see how the board deals with that. But agencies, that often the knee-jerk reaction is deny, delay, deny, make expensive, so that the transparency that is intended by the statute doesn't happen. And that's a cultural shift that we absolutely have to get control over. And frankly, I think that Anton's law has become a point of spear in raising the stakes to the point that we're already seeing more work in the appellate courts around interpreting the statute. Whether that's going to work well for us in the end, or we're going to have to go back to the legislature if we don't get what we need from the courts, remains to be seen.
Thank you for that. So, Lisa, I want to turn to you. Oh, but you're gone again. Is she coming
No,
back?
I'm here. I'm here. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry. I was like, where are you? So, from your perspective, you see a wide range. Deb talked about what it feels like as a requester, and knowing that those changes, they're still coming into effect. What do you have? What does it look like from your standpoint?
Yeah, I wanted to kind of follow up on a couple of comments and points Deb was making, and also to offer a few data points. They're very limited. Deb is right. We are in the very early days of implementing House Bill 183, or the Equitable Access Act. But we have 6 months in my office, and for the board, we have 6 months worth of data at this point. And I have two observations from that data. One is, and that leads me to think the act is having its intended effect. At least to a limited extent in these early months. One is the board is getting more complaints than it used to. It is getting them, and 50% of them in the past 6 months have involved denials. So that's 6 complaints involving denials that would not have otherwise been heard. They were matters that, mediation was attempted. It didn't resolve the matter. They went on to the board issued opinions. Besides those denial matters, there have been a couple of other interesting ones. All of these opinions are on the board's website, by the way, and my website contains a link to them, so anyone can read them at any time. There were 2 complaints to the board that involved failures to respond. So that's 2 failure to respond complaints that couldn't have been addressed in a user-friendly, decisional way before this act have been addressed in the past 2 months. One matter was filed. It was an interesting matter. It involved the method of search that was used. The board concluded it did not have jurisdiction over that matter, and it has decided additionally matters involving constructive denial, and that those can be matters not where the agency expressly denies it, but where no records are produced for whatever reason, and it in effect is a denial. So the board is being used in ways it wasn't being used before in accordance with its expanded jurisdiction. At the same time, I will say I am seeing a very noticeable impact on my caseload in terms of being able to move matters forward, keep them moving, engage with agencies more meaningfully, and actually get more matters resolved. We've had over the last 6 months about 73% of my matters have resolved fully. In contrast, unresolved matters and partially resolved matters comprised about 16% of the caseload. So if you'll recall, back when we were working on this bill, we did some very detailed projections about how many and what percentage we thought would go to the board. And our batting average for the past 6 months is exceeding those expectations. So I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic that this act is an important step in the right direction, and as time goes by, will be used even more effectively. On fee issues specifically, I would agree with Deb that the provisions in the statute, the Public Information Act currently, about when fee waivers should be granted or not, or under what conditions, the provisions are not particularly illuminating. And they're open to really a broad array of interpretations. And that can lead to problems in itself. So I think that is something that is well worth continued study, examination, and exploration of improvements. And in that regard, I would note that I believe this past last session, there is a task force that's been created, at least it's on the books, to create a task force to look at fees specifically in the context of record requests to police departments. Right. And they're supposed to issue a report on this. So when that comes about, I would think that data could be very important in terms of understanding the dimensions of the problem, what the options are, what agencies need to do in order to be able to respond more efficiently, and with less cost. I do suspect that over time, as time goes on, and the police departments become more, they have adapted rather to Anton's law and the need to be able to produce internal affairs records, something they didn't have to do in the past, that they will divide. They will come up with more efficient ways to do it, and particularly with regard to historical records, that they won't have to redo work that they've had to do at the startup phase. So again, I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I do think there's reason for some optimism here. There's reason for some hope.
Well, and that's wonderful to hear, because you're the one that's hearing all of those disputes and those fees those disputes and those seeing how to navigate through them. I want to turn to Comptroller Lierman right now and recognize that she needs to leave us at 4:45. So before we let her slip through our fingers, I wanted to ask you, what can agencies do? You now have an agency of your own. And, in 5 days you haven't figured out how you're going to fix the world. But I wouldn't put it past you.
No,
but what do you
maybe
think
more than 5
agencies
days
can do and custodians can do about these issues?
I think this is a really interesting question, and one that, as I have entered the Comptroller's office, taking my hat of proactive disclosure with me, and my interest in the PIA, one of the things that I've discovered, for instance, is sort of the lack of there's amazing technology out there that would allow agencies to more simply and frankly more cheaply answer PIAs, right? If we had up-to-date and used good document management systems. And I will tell you, in the Comptroller's office right now, there are 6 document management systems being used in one agency. And so it's just, one of my tasks is to get that down to 1, right? And then to make sure that everybody is actually using it, right? But there are these real practical issues that need to be addressed at agencies and in offices that are subject to the PIA in order for there to be actual compliance with the law on the books, right? So it's sort of not necessarily that these, that people said, oh, we'll use 6 different DMS systems to foil the plans of the PIA. It's that, well, this division used that one, and then this other division found another one that it liked, and so it sort of organically happens. But because that happens, it makes it nearly impossible to quickly and cheaply and easily answer a PIA. So I think one of the things that we need to do is to prioritize working with agencies to make sure that they have the technology in place to be able to do this work in a way that we all know is possible, right? I'll say the second thing that needs to happen is that they have to have the personnel assigned, right? So right now, I will tell you in almost every agency there's not a full-time position for somebody to respond to PIA requests. Maybe in some places that get voluminous PIAs there are, but in most places there are not. They're certainly not in the Comptroller's office. The person who is the PIA respondent in the Comptroller's office literally has 3 other major jobs to do. So that is always, the PIA is just, it's always going to fall off, right? Because there's more urgent things that need to be done. And so I think it's also deciding, are we going to provide proper funding or something to ensure that there's personnel that can actually prioritize this work, right? And then finally, I do want to emphasize that one of the things that we worked on when we worked on the legislation is something that Lisa brought up, that we were trying, when we passed this bill, we wanted to make sure that agencies understood that we were trying to ensure that people who had sort of, I'll say like, requests that were sort of not one time, but that were honest and necessary and well thought out requests were being prioritized over sort of vexatious filers, right? People who were emailing every day for all of the emails from one person, just to sort of be challenging, right? And so we tried to give agencies a way to make sure that they could prioritize those truly, those actual, I'll say for lack of a better word, sort of honest, needed documents, and for the truly vexatious filers that agencies could say, now wait a second, like, you're just asking for this to ask for it. You're not, and you've been asking for the same thing repeatedly for the past 6 months, despite us, fulfilling it. So I think those are all things that I think are important for us to keep in mind. I will say, one of the reasons that I feel so strongly about modernizing the Comptroller's office, there are a plethora of reasons, making it easier to track dollars, making it easier to see how our contracts are being awarded and if they're being carried out faithfully to what was presented to the Board of Public Works. And also so that we can do the work of providing true transparency, because so many of the systems that exist right now, the technology systems that exist, the dashboard systems that exist, provide more of like an open book, right, to people to see what's happening. But these have costs, right? It's real costs. And so we need to make sure that we are funding these types of programs, even though they sound sort of like, oh, it's just another IT program. It's not, because at the end of the day, if you're procuring good systems, you're able to provide this proactive disclosure in a way so that people don't have to always take the time to file PIAs or go through these systems. So I think that's something that I'm very focused on, that I feel very strongly about. It's funny, somebody just emailed me to show me all the different DMS systems, because it was literally one of my first questions was, if somebody, requests documents, how do we find them? And when there's 6 different systems in one agency, you just can never know that you've done a complete job and done all the work that you need to. So those are just a couple points that I would keep in mind when thinking through how we are lobbying and advocating for better proactive disclosure, is to make sure that we're thinking about the technology capabilities, we're thinking about the personnel needs as well. So I'm really excited to keep working with you all on this issue. It's so important. It provides for, I really do believe that transparency provides for more accountability, which can then increase our belief in good government. And I want to, keep making sure that we're doing the best that we can. So thank you.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for
My
being with
pleasure.
us and making the time.
Yeah,
And
my pleasure.
a very busy schedule. We'll let you go.
Thanks. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Good to see you, Deb. Thanks, everybody.
And we'll kind of wind up with that concept of what agencies and custodians can do. You know, what Brooke said is it kind of boils down in some ways to staffing and records management. But are there other, and just as an aside, I have heard Governor Moore cite a figure of, I think, 10,000 state jobs are unfilled at this point, and his goal is to fill 5,000 of them this year. And so they're not all going to be PIA custodians, but let's hope that some are, so that we can get some traction to that. But aside from staffing and records management, and I know Lisa loves records management, is there anything else that is needed that custodians and agencies should do? Well,
I warned Rebecca that I'd have more to say on this than on anything else, so bear with me. We've talked about the culture change that's needed. Specifically, the culture change we need in the executive, in the legislature, throughout all of the government agencies, state and local, is the recognition that public access to government records is a core function of every government agency. It is as important as keeping our ponds and wetlands clean, as patrolling our streets and engaging in law enforcement, as every other function of a government organization. It's not a side gig, it's not somebody else's job, it's not an unfunded mandate, it's not any of the things we often hear government agencies describe it as. It is a core function, and that's the culture change that we need, and that will drive so much of what else needs to be fixed about Public Information Act compliance in Maryland. So that's first. Once we embrace that view, there won't be an impetus to pass the cost of providing the records on to the person requesting the records, which is one of the problems we've been discussing today. And it doesn't work that way in other places. In most states and under the federal government, records are provided free of charge more than 90% of the time. That is not the case in Maryland. Definitely not the case in Maryland. So, what else do we need? The fee waiver, the fee provision in the statute itself, turns out the impetus for it was that narrow category of commercial requests. Companies asking for records related to their business and a desire to somehow improve their commercial status, their profit margins in their business and so forth. Outside of that context, why should there be the ability to charge fees at all? That's one question for us to grapple with. The fee waivers should become routine. I think it's less than 1% of FOIA requests to the federal government are not granted a fee waiver. The script is so flipped in Maryland that it's really staggering. So fee waivers should become routine. They should be presumptively granted. We need clear guidance in the statute or in the Compliance Board of Regulations. The board has currently taken the position that it needs new statutory authority in order to write regulations about fees and fee waivers. Okay, so that's another expansion of the board's authority that may be necessary. As I mentioned, currently there's sort of unfettered discretion in agencies to decide fees, to decide waivers, to decide whether they're going to insist on the payment of the fees before they'll produce the records, another barrier to getting the records. Ultimately, what we need is that when a person or an entity meets the criteria for a waiver, that the waiver be mandatory, not discretionary. That doesn't mean that every waiver request that's asked for has to be granted. That's not what mandatory means. It means if you're eligible for the waiver, either the public interest waiver or the indigency waiver, then the waiver is mandatory. How does that change where we are now? It means that the only thing that goes, it means that the agency is going to have to do it if you meet the standards. So we need clear standards, and then they have to give it to you if you meet the standards. They can deny the request, but then the review by the compliance board, assuming it eventually has the authority, or the review by the court will be, was the person legally eligible? Was the public interest organization legally eligible? If so, the agency was wrong to deny the waiver. That's very different from what goes on now, which is courts, following the wandering path of agencies, justifying often after the fact why they denied a fee waiver that prevented access to documents. We also need some, the theme here is that many of the ways in which we are currently operating under this statute are very clearly contrary to the purpose of the statute. Very clearly, absolutely the opposite of the legislative intent under the Public Information Act. And that drives, exactly what we need for changes. Very, very briefly, it's becoming clearer and clearer in the last several years that we need some changes to the judicial review provisions in the statute as well. Because the relationship between the Public Information Act and administrative law in Maryland is a real mishmash, and also, again, very contrary to the purpose of the Public Information Act. Two very quick examples. Generally speaking, under administrative law, if a court is reviewing an agency decision, it applies a very, very deferential standard called arbitrary and capricious. Unless the agency's decision was arbitrary and capricious, which means completely irrational, totally foolish, the court can only say, might not have been the way I would have decided it, but it's up to the agency. That's grounded in the notion that the agency has expertise that the court doesn't have in its area of functioning. That doesn't really apply to access to government records. That's not the area of expertise of the Department of Natural Resources, for example, or any other government agency. So that deferential standard is not serving the purpose of the Public Information Act. On the other in the other extreme, usually under administrative law, the court's review of the agency's decision is based solely on the record before the agency and solely on the reason that the agency gave. Under case law that has developed under our Public Information Act, the agency doesn't even have to give the requester a reason for a denial of the records or a denial of a fee waiver. It can wait to see whether the person can go to court or go to the board and then provide the justification. And it can add to the justification during the various stages of the process. And the court has to consider all of that, even if it's a post hoc rationalization, even if the requester never had an opportunity to address any of it. That's really, really got administrative law in this state turned on its head, but it's only applicable under the Public Information Act. So that stuff needs to get sorted out, and that's becoming clearer and clearer with cases that that are winding their way through the courts at the moment.
So it sounds like in some ways, the litigation that is going on serves to clarify. So a lot of the opinions that are coming out of the Open Meetings Compliance Board can help guide custodians to say this is the way things need to be done, but it's the litigation that really provides that precedent to say this is how it's going to be.
Well, yes, but as we've all seen, as we're familiar with, sometimes the results in litigation only sort of muddy things more, and then we have to go to the legislature.
Right. So it's a big sort of wide issue. I'm just really mindful of time because I know we've got Delegate Corman here to talk about open and transparent bills. But Lisa, did you have anything that you add?
I want to add one kind of undisguised self-interested commercial. My office does training, PIA trainings on request for agencies, requester groups, anyone who asks us. We will make arrangements to try to provide PIA training suited to their needs. In addition to doing these kind of agency-specific or requester group-specific type of trainings, where we've started experimenting with a kind of brown bag lunch training approach, whereby we open it up to anyone to come. And we did one late last year where we did an overview, and we said anybody in the world can come. We had a great turnout. But in the future, what we'd like to do is target areas that are problematic for people or that are particularly in need of some further explanation. So, for example, we're thinking we might do some on discretionary exemptions. We could do something on fees. We could do something on tracking PIA requests. We could do, any topics that really help people use the Act and administer the Act more effectively. So I do think training is an important ingredient. In addition to everything else that has been mentioned, technology, personnel, leadership messaging, culture, in addition to all of those things, I think training is a very important ingredient, and it's something people can do right now.
Absolutely. Great. That's a terrific thought. With your permission, I'd like to invite Delegate Corman up to talk about some of the transparency bills that are ahead of us, and then we can take questions for any of them. That way we don't have to do two sets of
I got like a Jerry Springer thing going on
you
here.
Could totally Jerry Springer it. Come on. Just remember, your camera's right there.
Sorry, so you just want me to talk about the two bills?
Yeah, so, and actually, please introduce yourself for
Great.
those who may not know you, and then you have a couple bills coming up next week. Actually, I just don't want there to be feedback.
Yeah. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. I am the guy standing between you and your weekend, also known as Mark Corman. I'm a state delegate from Montgomery County, just starting my third term, and I've been working on a couple bills that might be of interest. One with Senator Kagan. Actually, this is a follow-on to sort of years of effort we've had of having more and more of our kind of state boards and commissions and our quasi-government agencies that are governed by boards live stream their meetings and have firmer requirements on posting their agendas. It started with the State Board of Elections, but it's expanded out to lots of other boards and commissions at the state level. This year's effort is around the Ethics Commission, the Maryland State Ethics Commission, which obviously does a lot of really important work that you all are interested in. Their meetings are open to the public. They can go into closed session under the Open Meetings Act, like a lot of other bodies can, but you have to actually drive to their headquarters to go to their meetings. They don't live stream their meetings. And so this year's bill would require that they live stream, the portion of the meetings that are open to the public. And again, this is building on, similar legislation required for the Maryland Environmental Service Board, for the University System of Maryland Board of Regents, lots of other kind of quasi-government agencies that meet in these kind of board-like settings where their meetings were always technically open, but you had to know where they were, when they were, and get there at the right time. I'll just say for me, I sort of started down this road with the State Board of Elections because I had a lot of advocates in my district that were very interested in the work the State Board was doing. And I thought, gosh, it'd be very sensible if the State Board of Elections just live streamed their meetings, especially because every one of our counties has its own board that needs to know what the State Board is up to. And why should a Garrett County, Board of Elections person have to drive to Annapolis to get to a meeting. So that made a lot of sense to me, but I thought, gosh, before I sort of mandate a bill like this, I should walk down and watch a meeting at the Board of Elections. So I was in Annapolis for something at my office here, and the Board of Elections meeting was that day. So I walked down the street, and they said, "Oh, can we help you?" I said, "I'm here for the board meeting." And they said, "Oh, it already happened. We moved it an hour earlier." I had totally missed it. Somehow back then their board meetings were only an hour. You can tell it was before all the craziness we deal with now. And of course that was a frustration to me, but I had just walked a block, to get to the meeting. If I had driven from Garrett County as a Garrett County Board of Elections member, I would have been pretty miffed. But of course, if the meeting was streamed online, it wouldn't have mattered at all, because I could have just opened up YouTube and watched the meeting. So it's a real kind of easy, simple way to open up government. I think it's been pretty successful, but of course the big thing that happened with the efforts of Senator Kagan and I is COVID. And all these things that had been open could very easily shift to being online, since we weren't letting anybody walk into the rooms for the meetings, not for any nefarious purpose, but for public health purposes. So looking forward to trying to expand that effort to the State Ethics Commission this year. And then the other bill, which actually we've been working on with the Comptroller, who was just here, involves public comment at the Board of Public Works. The Board of Public Works is an incredibly important element of our state government. It's almost a fourth branch. It's the governor, it's the comptroller, and the state treasurer. You actually have the comptroller explain it to you. She does a great little few minutes about the power of the Board of Public Works and all of the things they do. But one thing they occasionally do is take public comment, but it's very unofficial. They try to put things in the record when they get emails. On some things that get a lot of public attention, they'll actually have the mic open and let people sort of line up and make comments. But it's all kind of unofficial. And so I'm working with Senator Shelley Hettleman from Baltimore County to make that process more of a sort of regular filing system, so that when you submit, you can submit something through an online portal to submit it into the record. The treasurer, the comptroller, and the governor will all see it in their packets. It'll be posted with the board agenda on the BPW website. They post their agendas the Friday before their meetings. And so it'll make a much more sort of transparent approach than what happens now, which is, it is true, if you happen to email the Board of Public Works and say, please reject this contract or please reject this land sale, they'll try to put it into the record, but it's all sort of very unofficial, very hush-hush. This will open it up and make it more transparent and open, and frankly, over time, might make more people even bother to write in to the Board of Public Works, which again is a kind of less known but pretty important element of our state government. So I know there's tons of other transparency bills coming from my colleagues, but those are two I'm working on with Senator Kagan and Senator Hettleman, and I appreciate a few minutes before you go to share them with you.
Great, thank you so much. And so I think to add to that, we have the remote court access bills that are coming up, some police accountability legislation that's coming. So it is a really, I guess, fecund time, a very, transparency is getting a lot of attention now, and I feel like this is a wave that advocates really need to push to make all of our voices heard. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take one or two. Sure.
I'm particularly interested in getting the Ombudsman's feedback on this, so that's why I wanted to get the question in before it
Sure.
disappears.
Well, and Lisa's very is available, so you can always email or call her.
I'm concerned about the fee waiver issue as a way of getting, avoiding the requirements, but I'm also concerned about the, the MPIA does not require us to create records, okay? And you have database systems where I know a school system has a table that has student ID number, what school they go to, and their race. I know they have another table that has the student ID number and their absences due to bus transportation not being provided, for instance. I want to do an analysis of the impact of bus analysis. They don't have to create it for me. I don't want them to create it for me. I just want them to give me a dump of those two tables.
Sure. And actually, that's very close to the media's heart as well, because data analysis is a systematic way to look at a topic, and I think that's how a lot of the police accountability bills have come about, because you need that large scale data. You don't need to know that Cindy Jones, who's Latina, did not make it to the bus.
No name identification information associated with that, just the race.
Sure.
But you need the detail in order to do the real analysis.
Lisa, do you want to address that briefly?
Sure. This is actually a very common type of issue that comes up. And I don't want to comment on things that may come to me in mediation because my process is required to be confidential. However, I would invite you to call me or email me. I'd be very happy to talk with you about what your needs are and what the state of the law is. I will say this, in general, agencies are required to produce data that, assuming the data is disclosable, that they can access through using ordinary functional means that are at their disposal. So, for example, you give an example of an agency having the ability to produce or generate a table from their existing system using existing software, existing personnel, all within the ordinary course of their business. There are, in my view, there are cases in Maryland that recognize the duty of an agency to produce that, assuming it's disclosable. In terms of digital records and data type of request, what they're not required to do is to go out and purchase a whole new software system, or go hire a consultant to tell them how to convert something from one format to another. I mean, so there can be gray areas and ambiguities, particularly when we're dealing with new technologies. But in general, I think we're far enough along in the digital age, and the courts have recognized that when an agency has the ability to produce data and that data is disclosable, then it should be produced under the Act.
A quick follow-up on that. If I were to find, I see that certain jurisdictions are great with open data, and then their county executive leaves, and it dies. It's old, okay? So if I find myself a friendly county executive to work with, and can we file a friend of the brief to get a position, like, the court, a friendly court, a brief of the, I can't remember, like you draw, can we bring a case to you friendly, we both agree, but we want you to rule so it can be used as a guideline for others to say, hey.
So the issue is more best practice,
Yeah.
and is there a way to get the PIA compliance board to say, yes, this is a definitive thing? Did you have something to add to that?
There is a question. But answer the question, yeah.
Okay. Lisa, did you want to address that?
Well, I can't speak for the board. The board is an independent entity, and its jurisdiction is defined by statute. It does not issue advisory opinions. It only issues opinions on matters that come to it in the process provided by statute and that involve issues that are within its jurisdiction. I think as a practical matter, there are plenty of ways to publicize good practices, to try to promote those, to try to enlist the help of public officials in doing that. So I think there are a lot of options. I would invite you to look at the Ombudsman website and the PIA Compliance Board website. And see if any of the resource material that are posted there may shed light on some of these questions. And if not, I invite you to call me or email me. I'd be happy to set up a time and talk to you.
Great. All right, thank you so much. We have time for one question, so it's going to go to you, and I'm going to lure Joanne up to make our closing remarks.
I'd just like to say that it's hard to know what you can get out of the data systems here, but the Maryland longitudinal data system can do exactly what you asked for. The thing is, people don't know that. But the main thing that I like to bring up is that it's the 21st century. And Google's been out for a long time. Everybody knows that if you go to Google, you can get all kinds of information. There is no reason why the state of Maryland can't have a system exactly like that to find all the information we need in order to have good government.
That's a great point, and so there can be technology that brings that together. So thank you for that. Wanted to also thank Deb Gardner and Lisa Kershner, our two panelists today, and of course Delegate Corman had to leave. But thank you all for coming today. I will let Joanne close us out and see you on the other side of the door for snacks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we really want to give a special thank you to Lisa. We know it's always a busy time for her, but she made it up. I don't know what is happening with the screen, but she made it a priority to join us today. Before I wrap up, I did want to pass it on to our Outreach and Engagement Manager, Casey Hunter, to make a quick call to action to you all.
Hello, I'm sure you've seen me running around the room by now, but I just wanted to thank you all for coming today, and I will be leading our transparency and access campaign that we're developing right now as we go into session. In order to help us develop that, we would love for you all to scan the QR code on one of these little cards. They are out there at the front table. They're on the little cocktail tables. Yes, and the same QR code is in the back of the program. We really just want to hear from you of how transparency and barriers to accessing government impact you in your lives. You heard a lot from us today, so we'd just love to see how you all are experiencing this.
Thank you. So again, please make sure you take that survey. It really is going to inform our work around the PIA, open meetings, and in navigating legislative proceedings at the state level and at the local level. Hopefully the conversations we had today kind of get you thinking, and honestly, even some of the feedback that was shared already, you saw Senator Carter left and literally is working on filing a bill. I think it's 5 o'clock, so she probably got it in on time. And now we're even considering some additional changes that are needed with some of the protocols that are being released. Before we wrap up today, I did just want to say a special thank you to partners who spent a great deal of time helping us put this together. Like literally, I kid you not, I just thought up this event out of the blue. I remember having a call, maybe it was with Rebecca, and Rebecca's like, yes, let's do it. And she literally dived in. Sam, who's not with us today, really played a critical role in everything from like creating a new logo for the coalition to creating our banner and so forth. So we appreciate her. Obviously our partners at ACLU of Maryland, League of Women Voters of Maryland, Public Justice Center, Court Watch PG. Hold on. Oh, he's not talking to me. Yes, the Campbell Foundation for obviously supporting us for years around our transparency efforts, and so many more partners who I am forgetting who could not join us today. And special thank you to those who were able to tune in via the stream. So again, there were a few actions that were shared. Take the survey. There's a hearing, literally, on Wednesday around the court access bill. That means testimony would need to be submitted on Monday for the House, Tuesday for the Senate. I don't remember the bill numbers right now, so Dr. Carmen, I want to say it's SB 43 and HB 113. It's under her bio. We need your help, and we will send you one-pagers. We will, and you've heard Delegate Corman share a few, so we will make sure we compile them. We're also working on making the website go live, so that will be a resource as well, where all of the bills are listed. I think our other ask is that if you are engaging in the legislative process, especially as each committee is releasing its protocols, please flag for any of us what the issues are, even if it's, let's say, the chair taking the camera and pointing it up in the air like they do fairly often, so that we can call leadership to see if we can get that corrected. So thank you all for bearing through the day with us. I think we had some really robust conversations. There are light refreshments for you all, so there are appetizers outside, a cash bar. Even though there's a cash bar, there's free soda and other refreshments at the bar as well. And obviously take the opportunity to network, grab materials from outside, and so forth. But thank you all so much for coming out today. And if you're on social media, follow MD OpenGov. Yes, that is where you will get your most recent updates. MD OpenGov. MDDOG. It's something like that, but OpenGov MD. That works? Perfect. But if you search MDOG, MDOG, literally, just MDOG. So thank you all so much. When we send out our email, it will also include information on how to join the coalition. It sounded like we had some great ideas, especially around advocacy at the local level. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you to the Governor's Calvert House, obviously, for hosting us, and for the tech team for working through everything. Thank you, thank you. But refreshments, thank you. Thank you, thank you. I will.